This build started off great, but ended up becoming, without a doubt, some of the worst few months of my entire life. It had everything: some of the rarest and most expensive wood in the world, new tools, questionable decisions, and failure after failure after failure. This guitar is making me want to quit building guitars altogether. But in the end, redemption.
Oh, it's so good, man. Oh, it's so good.
It all started with this wood right here. Believe it or not, this is ebony. It's not the ink black ebony that most people associate with the species. That's Gaboon ebony from West Africa. What I'm using here is from Southeast Asia, and it's called pale moon ebony. I've always wanted to build a guitar from it, but it can be incredibly difficult to find sets that are stable enough to make a guitar out of. The biggest issue with pale moon ebony is that the density of the light colored sections is significantly less than the dark veins that run through it, and this means that if it's not dried and cured correctly, it can be very unstable. The reason I was willing to use it for this project is because I purchased this set a couple of years ago from a reputable dealer, and I know that it's stable. It's been acclimating to my shop conditions for close to 2 years at this point, and confidence was high that it wouldn't bite me in the ass by cracking halfway through the build. At least that's what I had hoped. More on that later. What you just saw Matt doing there was book matching the two large pieces together to make the back panel for the guitar, as well as putting the sides into our side bending machine so that we can use heat and steam to coax the wood into the shape of the guitar. We were both more than a little concerned about the wood splitting during this side bending step, because the moisture and heat from that process is a recipe for cracks to appear. There's a crack.
Hey, yeah, okay.
Yeah, so we've got this crack here, which not super surprising because of where it's at. There's a reason why we bent it the way we did, so this was on the unbent part, but it's just a shrinking and expanding rate thing. But I think we'll be able to squeeze this back together and get that sealed up, and because we laminate our sides with another piece of wood for strength, I think we're going to be okay. Now, whether it does it on the other one worse or less is TBD. So, oh, he's not even split all the way through. Look, on the backside, it's not even split all the way through.
Oh, okay.
Okay, well, that didn't take long. Well, I'm sure the second side will bend just fine, though, right?
You're going to split in the exact same spot.
Son of a... Thankfully, these little fractures in the wood ended up not being a big deal at all once we laminated them with their Indian rosewood liners. Now, I didn't get this step on camera, but if you'd like to learn more about how and why we do this to our sides, we actually have a full series on how to build an acoustic guitar from start to finish on our channel. So if you want to know more about that, go check it out. With the lamination process complete, I just needed to clean up all of that leftover epoxy and create the rim of the body of the guitar. At that point, I had Matt glue on the mahogany lining strips to further increase the stiffness of the sides, as well as give us more gluing surface for the top and back of the body once we get to that step. But before we can call this rim finished, I wanted to add a bit of a premium option to the guitar in the form of an arm bevel. The point of this bevel is to make the guitar a lot more comfortable when you play it by chamfering the edge of the soundboard in the area that your arm rests on the body. The downside is that it's a bit of a pain to do. The first thing that I had to do was carve the initial bevel into the side and then glue in this mahogany block that'll become the foundation of the bevel moving forward. I then have to remove as much wood as I can from the inside and clean up all of that before I can call this step complete. Now there's a lot more involved in completing this bevel, but for now we'll set this aside so that I can go about making the soundboard of the guitar. For this build, I went with a classic, Adirondack spruce. Because I've never actually built a guitar out of pale moon ebony before, I didn't know how it would affect the final tone of the guitar. So I wanted to give it the best chance for success by using a wood for the top that always delivers. Adirondack spruce is native to the east coast of the US and is known for being the wood that's used on iconic instruments such as pre-war Martins. It's always been one of my favorite soundboards to use, and it makes for an incredibly loud guitar that has amazing bass and trebles, as well as a classic look that only gets better with time. Matt went ahead and book matched the two pieces for me, just like he did with the back, and then he used the CNC machine to cut out the initial shape, as well as route out the pocket for the rosette and the sound hole. At which point, I could inlay the abalone rosette into the soundboard. What I'm using here is a product called ZipFlex from Advanced Shell Technology, and it makes this job a lot easier. The product is basically just small pieces of abalone shell that are glued to a flexible Teflon strip, and this allows me to bend it around curves a lot more quickly without having to break the shell by hand like I did when I used solid strips of shell. The ZipFlex is a lot more expensive than the solid strips, but the finished results are better and it saves me a ton of time. With the abalone inlaid, I then run it all through the drum sander one last time and take the soundboard down to its final thickness. And this takes us to the most important step of any acoustic guitar build. But before I explain to you how I do that, I'd like to ask a favor. If you enjoy this video, consider subscribing to our channel. Matt and I love creating this content for you, but it can be incredibly labor and time intensive to do so. So by showing your support with a simple click of that subscription button, it really helps to keep us motivated to make more videos just like this in the future. And with that, I'll let my past self take it from here. Here we go. We've got all the braces glued onto this soundboard. You guys can see them all on here. But now we have to do the process of voicing this soundboard, which is basically taking all of these braces and then taking a chisel and shaving them down until we get to a point where this guitar top becomes musical, because at this point it's incredibly stiff. We could finish the guitar with it like this, but it would sound absolutely terrible because this top is way too stiff and it won't actually translate a lot of those vibrations into the soundboard in a musical way. Let me give it a tap at this point so that you guys can get a sense of how tight the top is, I hope. It's got a very quick decay on it. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and move this over to the vacuum clamp. We're going to take chisels and we're going to take planes and we'll start shaving these things down. And you guys hopefully at home will begin to hear this top really start to open up and become a lot more musical. I'll tap on it again at the midway point and then I'll tap on it again once I feel like the top is fully voiced. And then we'll compare those and you guys will really get a sense of how much more musical I can make this soundboard by carefully listening to it and analyzing it and trying to make it musical using my hand planes. Okay, phase one of the voicing is finished. You guys saw me carve off a lot of that wood, but we're not there yet. We still have quite a bit of a ways to go before this soundboard is what I would consider fully voiced. But I wanted to give you guys an opportunity to hear what it sounds like at this point. So let's give it a tap. Once again, just using this lapel microphone. So we're getting a little bit of a flutter, like a whoop. So it's starting to really open up, way less tight than it was before, but I can tell just at this point, especially when I'm feeling it, it's very stiff still. So we have some more material that we need to remove. I'd say we're about 80% of the way there, but this is where the real magic happens. When you're getting close, you go from like it being really stiff to all of a sudden, boom, it starts to really open up. So we have to be careful at this point. Let's get it back in the clamp and do some more shaping. Okay, so we've got a lot more of that material removed, and I'm basically, at this point, happy with how it is voiced. I still have some more work to do, but I wanted to give you guys a quick tap on it so you could hear how much more it's opened up. So we're getting a lot longer sustain on it. It's starting to get the flex that I'm looking for kind of over here on the wings. Last thing that I need to do, obviously, is clean everything up. At this point, we've just kind of hogged off material and it's not the most beautiful. So we're going to smooth everything out, get it all nice and smooth. And then I'm also going to be carving all of these braces in a way that is instead of it being a squared off top, it's going to be more of a point, which allows us to remove material off the sides to get these braces lighter, but without removing any strength from it. So we'll do that, and then we'll get one more tap test for you guys to be able to hear what the final voicing sounds like. Okay, got this completely finished at this point. I would consider this guitar top totally voiced. It's crazy, you can actually feel how much lighter weight it is physically. It's got the right amount of flex to it. Let's do this final tap test so you guys can hear how much more opened up this top is. If I get that to ring the way that I want it to ring, I know that we are good to go and move on to the next step. But everybody's got their own opinions on how tapping should work. But that's what works for me, and I've been doing it this way for over 20 years. So yeah, what we need to do at this point is basically get this ready to get glued onto the sides. So we're moving right along. And as simple as that sounds, I still have a few steps before I can glue that top down. The first one that I have to do is sand a radius in the top and the back of the rim to match the dome that I've built into those plates. I use a 15-foot radius for the back and a 30-foot radius for the soundboard. I also have to cut notches into the sides to accommodate the braces that I put on the soundboard and the back of the guitar so that everything locks really tightly into one another. And once that's done, I then have to take that beautiful soundboard that we just made and then cut off a big old chunk of it to create that bevel that we started on the sides. It always feels really strange to do this to a perfectly good top, but you just gotta trust the process here. It's ugly at this point, but I promise if you stick around, the final results will be worth it. The process of gluing down the soundboard is fairly simple with the help of this amazing device that you see right here. It's called a go-bar deck, and it's used to apply a massive amount of pressure to a complex glue-up. This is done by placing these fiberglass rods called go-bars between the glue joint and the top of the jig. This forces the rods to bend and exert a force on the joint. It makes for fast clamping as well as precise pressure control, and it's honestly one of my favorite tools in the shop, even if it does take up way too much room. Okay, we've got the soundboard glued onto the sides, and it's kind of my favorite part of any guitar build because it's the most like luthery looking part of the guitar build where you get to still see all the braces and the shape of the guitar, and it has this very architectural look to it, and I just love it. It never gets old. But I wanted to show you guys one last time before we get about gluing the back onto this guitar body and closing it all up, what this now sounds like now that we've glued it onto the rim. Same thing, going to use this microphone here on my lapel, and we'll get a nice tap right here on the bridge plate. And it's sounding really nice. It's got a nice decay to it. I did off camera just because I was in a hurry to get it done. The very first time that I tapped it, I wasn't quite as happy with how it sounded, so removed a little bit of material from the tone bars instead of here to loosen up this lower half. We're talking about like minuscule stuff here. So the very last thing that I need to do before I can get this back glued on is take measurements of everything and then write all those measurements down inside my notebook here so that I have it for future reference. But really happy with how this sounds. Very nice and responsive, and I think it's going to yield a really wonderful sounding guitar. So yeah, I'm going to measure this stuff, get it all written down, and then we can move on with the next step, which is fitting the back for the sides. As you can probably figure out for yourself, the back goes on exactly like the top did, but this time without the annoying added complexity of an arm bevel. Fit the back to the sides, and in the go-bar deck it goes. Let it clamp under pressure for a couple of hours, and then we finally get to see that closed up body for the first time. Looking a little rough around the edges, if I'm honest. But don't you worry, I'll get that extra material cut off with our trusty router table and a flush cut bit. What needs to happen next is the leveling of the sides of the body. So you may be wondering why I'm showing you footage of me slathering epoxy on the back of the guitar. Well, that's because this Pale Moon Ebony is too porous to get a good seal on my vacuum clamp, so I figured I could use some of my pore filling epoxy to stabilize the wood and seal it up to see if that would help. After all, I'll be putting this stuff all over the back and sides later in the build, so why not start a little early? I let that sit overnight, and it seems to have worked. Okay, on with the task of leveling the sides. This step, while simple looking, is actually really important to the final fit and finish of the entire guitar. And that's because what we're doing here is removing any lumps or unevenness in the sides so that we can ensure that the binding that I'm about to install goes in without any gaps or fitment issues. Now, you'll want to take note of what I just said there because we're starting to get to the part of this build where the wheels fall off. It won't be happening just yet, but I'm starting to make decisions now that'll directly lead to this moment. Just because I was seriously ready to smash this guitar onto the floor. Now just sit tight because we'll get to that, I promise. But first, we'll let naive past me do a little bit of talking. Okay, we've got our sides totally leveled out now, and they came out really, really nice. This is totally smooth with no lumps whatsoever. It took a little bit more work than you guys saw on camera. I took about another hour just kind of going through this whole thing with my hands, getting it completely smooth. But with that, we are ready to move on to the next step, which is cutting our binding channels. So what we're going to be doing is using a jig that's just outside of camera here, you guys can't see it, to cut a ledge around the front and the back of this entire guitar so that we can put this Macassar ebony binding around the entire instrument, as well as abalone and a thing called purfling, which is a decorative trim as well. These do two things. First of all, what they do is they look nice, which is a nice thing. It kind of accents the entire instrument and borders the whole thing, gives it a nice clean look. But what it does most importantly and functionally is it actually protects all of the end grain from the wood, which is this portion of the wood that comes down here, from causing any cracks or anything. If this guitar were to bang into something like a wall or a table or something, cracks could happen really easily if there wasn't any binding on it. So it's not really an option in my opinion. A lot of really cheap guitars will come without binding because this can be labor intensive, but we have to do it here, and I would never dream of doing a guitar without binding. So we'll get that fired up, and I will talk you through the process of how we go about doing it next. Bending up the Macassar ebony binding is done exactly the same way as I bent up the sides. I spray them with a little bit of water and load them into the side bending machine and then let all of the heat and steam do the heavy lifting. Now I used to bend all of my binding by hand, but find that the side bender makes that job a lot faster. But I'll soon find out why faster isn't always better. From there, it's time to glue up all of the trim pieces at the same time, and this includes the newly bent up ebony binding, as well as a strip of blue abalone shell, just like I used for the rosette on the soundboard, and then 2 strips of black and white purfling to make it all pop. Typically I use wood glue to hold everything in place, but wanted to be sure that I wouldn't end up with a visible glue joint where the binding meets the body, so I decided to try something a little different this time. I used Z-epoxy to pore fill the wood prior to spraying the finish on the guitar. So why not use it as my glue for this step? After all, it's clear and designed to fill tiny gaps in wood without any visible artifacts. My only concern was whether or not it had the holding strength I needed to prevent the binding and abalone shell from coming separated from the joint. I guess there's only one way to find out. As you can see, it ended up turning into a bit of a mess. The Z-epoxy actually has a much lower viscosity than the standard wood glue that I normally use, so it ended up running all over the back and sides of the body as I was trying to clamp everything into place with my binding tape. This made for some tough sledding, as the tape wouldn't stick to the slippery glue, so I had to continuously wipe everything down with alcohol, and well, it was just a bit of a disaster. But I did eventually get everything into place. I then used this industrial rubber band to really clamp everything into place around the waist of the body, where I tend to have issues with clamping pressure. This entire process then needed to be repeated on the other side of the back before I could remove all the tape and clamps to reveal this as a result. Not bad, but I still need to do this to the front of the guitar, and things are a bit more complicated on that side because of the arm bevel that I installed earlier in the build. The method here was the same in the sense that I used the same glue and clamps, but things get complicated around the bevel portion of the soundboard. What needs to happen here is that ebony binding has to transition from being a solid piece of wood on the upper portion of the body, and then it has to split into 2 separate pieces to go around the bevel. I make the solid wood binding go around the side of the body and then curve the abalone shell and purfling around the top of the soundboard. Now I know this sounds complicated, and honestly, it kind of is. But hopefully you get an idea of what I'm trying to describe with the footage that I'm showing you here. The abalone shell and purfling section of the bevel then needs to be properly glued into place with some super glue before I can then put that body back on the vacuum clamp to level out all of the binding with the sides in preparation for the final step of creating the arm bevel, which is carving the actual bevel into the block of mahogany that I glued onto the sides earlier in the build. As I start to chisel away the wood, you can see that the transition is starting to form between the portion of the body that has the solid binding and into the part that has the bevel. I have to be really careful here not to sand into the abalone trim, as well as to ensure that everything is smooth and as flat as possible. This step just takes a lot of patience and a variety of different tools to get right, but it's always satisfying to finally see it all come together in one smooth transition. Okay, now that we have the arm bevel carved into the body of the guitar, what I need to do now is make the veneer to go over it. So our binding on the guitar is actually made out of Macassar ebony, and I got to looking through my wood stash and realized I don't have any Macassar ebony that I can then turn into veneers. But what I do have is this awesome set of kind of orphaned back and sides that I have used for other projects, so I don't have the rest of the set. And this is just a nice classic ebony, and it has some really awesome white streaking in it that really kind of, I think, goes well with the back and sides on the guitar. So what I'm going to do is use this piece for the arm bevel, and then we're going to use this piece, which was the side, for the headstock overlay and the back of the headstock overlay as well. So what I need to do now is take them to the drum sander and basically turn them into veneers, getting them down to less than 1 millimeter thick. And then we can go about finishing up this veneer, and it's gonna look really good. I'm super stoked about it. I don't know what kind of ebony this is. Well, whatever it is, it's gonna look great on this guitar. After it's been thinned down to roughly 1 millimeter thick, I can then cut off a piece that I'd like to use for the veneer. I then apply classic wood glue to both surfaces and then let them dry for about 1 hour. At that point, I can use a piping hot iron to magically stick the veneer to the bevel foundation that I so carefully carved in the previous step. It's at this point that things start to get pretty serious. I have to use chisels and sandpaper to carefully carve off the excess veneer to reveal the final bevel. It's really easy to slip up and go too far on this procedure, and if that happens, I have to sand off the veneer and start completely over on this step. It happens more times than I'd like to admit, but thankfully for me, I got it right on the first try for this build. At this point, I can finally see what the entire body of the guitar looks like. Now, these arm bevels add a huge amount of extra work to the construction, but the final result is always worth it. It looks really cool, and it makes playing the finished guitar a lot more comfortable. The last thing I need to make before I can call this body completely finished is to install the end graft. This is just a decorative strip of wood that's used to cover up the seam where the two side pieces meet at the bottom of the guitar. For this build, I'll just be using a piece of Macassar ebony that's bound in abalone shell so that it matches all of the binding that's already on the guitar. I cut a pocket using a Dremel tool and some chisels and then used epoxy to glue it all into place. This step was then repeated on the back of the guitar to achieve the look that you see here. Looking really good, and now it's time to move on to the neck. All right, it's neck time on this guitar. Now, typically I make all of the necks for my acoustic guitars either out of Spanish cedar, like you see here, or out of mahogany. But on this guitar, with that amazing black and white ebony back and sides, I thought to myself, why don't we make the neck out of something that will go a little bit better with that? So what we're gonna do is make the neck out of some really cool black limba. This is a perfectly quarter sawn piece of wood. I believe it's 4 inches wide by 2 inches thick, which unfortunately is not big enough for me to make one of these roughed neck blanks out of. You can see if I set it on its side here, the headstock doesn't quite fit and the heel of the neck doesn't quite fit. So what I need to do is lop off the ends here, flip them around, and then glue them on themselves so that I can make this piece of wood large enough so that we can then take it over to the CNC machine and then cut it into its roughed in shape like you see here. I'm really excited to get this neck blank on the CNC machine though, because I think it's going to be absolutely killer looking. With the wood loaded onto the CNC machine, I can then run 2 operations on the neck blank. The first one cuts the side profile of the neck using a 1/2 inch end mill. I then rotate the neck blank by 90 degrees and then run the second operation, which cuts the top down profile as well as the truss rod and carbon fiber reinforcement channels. The CNC machine saves me a good bit of time here over doing these steps by hand on the bandsaw and router table like I used to. It also cuts the wood to a more accurate dimension, and this is really going to help us during the hand carving of the neck that I'll be doing here in a bit. Before I can make the fretboard, I need to install the 2 carbon fiber rods that we include in all of our guitars, using some System 3 T88 epoxy. I find that the carbon significantly increases the stability of the neck, as well as allows me to carve my necks to a much thinner profile because of the added strength that it provides. I'll let that sit overnight, and in the meantime, I'll get started on the fretboard. And for that, I'll be using this incredible piece of figured Gaboon ebony. I actually picked up this piece of wood a few years ago, and I've been waiting for the perfect project to use it on. I think it's going to be the perfect complement to that pale moon ebony back and sides that I made the body out of. And because this wood is so stunning all on its own, I don't plan on doing any sort of inlays or fret markers, as I feel that might take away from the natural beauty of the wood itself. The CNC machine is coming in clutch for me here to cut the fret slots as well as the ledge for some blue abalone shell, which will match the rest of the guitar beautifully. Whew, I mean, come on, look at that. That's so nice. I just need to wrap the entire fretboard in some Macassar ebony binding so that it matches the body, and I think you can see my vision of letting the natural beauty of the wood do all of the talking. Now I'd love to glue the fretboard to the neck at this point, but I still have a few more things that I need to make and do before that can happen. The headstock needs some attention, so I'll begin by making the back strap for it. This is something that I include in all of my guitar builds, and it adds a lot of strength for that neck to headstock transition area. It also looks really nice once the neck is fully carved. For the front of the headstock, I'll be making the faceplate out of the same piece of wood that I used for that arm bevel, and in hindsight, I'm 99% sure that this is actually Gabon ebony. I can then carefully inlay the driftwood logo into the headstock, and then I have to install all of the abalone trim around the border by hand to match the body and the fretboard. Once that's finished, I can then bind the overlay with Macassar ebony and admire the finished results of all of that work. There are certain steps in every build that are really important to get right. These steps require an extra dose of attention over the other steps because they do a lot in determining how good or bad the final guitar will end up being. For the final sound of the guitar, it was that voicing step. For the craftsmanship, it was the binding. And for playability, it's this step right here. Setting the neck involves cutting a mortise and tenon into the neck and the body, and then very slowly adjusting that joint until the neck angle is absolutely perfect. If I take my time and do it correctly, the geometry of the final guitar will be dialed in so that when I string it up for the first time, everything will be exactly where I need it to be. The light gauge D'Addario strings that I'll be putting on the guitar for the first time exert 175 pounds or 80 kilograms of tension into the top of the instrument. This force is also being supported by the neck, and it actually causes both of these parts of the guitar to slightly change shape because of that string tension that's on them. I have to compensate for this, as well as other factors like the fretboard thickness, what fret wire I'll be using, and how flexible the top is. Sometimes this step can take a whole day to get right, but today it went pretty smoothly and only took about an hour. Okay, let's put this neck together. I need to sand a radius into the fretboard before I can glue it on, and I do this with a special sanding block that has a 16-inch radius carved into it. I start with 80 grit and then work my way all the way up to 600 before I can then buff it out to a shine, and then it's finally ready to be glued on. I do this with classic LMI wood glue, a little binding tape to hold everything in place, and that same sanding caul that I used to radius the fretboard just a few minutes ago. This aluminum caul is machined completely flat across its length, and this helps to ensure that the fretboard is perfectly straight after being glued on to the neck. Up next, let's get the front headstock overlay glued on so that I can go about cutting the slots into it. You'd think that this is a step that I would have done earlier when I cut the top-down profile of the neck on the CNC machine, but it just doesn't work out that way, unfortunately. Because of the angle on the headstock, I have to cut the slots in by hand using this acrylic template and a laminate router. As for the question of why do I slot my headstock, well, I think it looks a lot better than the standard solid headstock that you see on most steel string guitars, but it also has a mechanical advantage in that it creates a steeper break angle of the string as it goes over the nut and down into the headstock of the guitar, and this in turn increases the pressure on the nut, and that increases the sustain of the notes being played. Before I can go about carving the neck into its final form, we need to install the frets. And for that, we'll be using this stainless steel fret wire from StewMac. I had Matt do all of the grunt work for me here in prepping the frets for installation. First he bends the fret wire into the same radius that we sanded into the fretboard, and then rough cuts 21 individual frets to length. At that point, he uses the specialty tool from StewMac to cut a ledge into each fret end so that it fits perfectly into each fret slot, but also goes up and over the abalone trim and ebony binding. At that point, I can go about pressing in each fret into the fretboard using this fret pressing caul in my drill press. I do want to point out that I'm really glazing over how much work actually goes into installing these stainless steel frets. Matt basically spent an entire afternoon carefully filing and shaping each fret end so that they install as perfectly as possible. If there's anything that we've learned over these years of building guitars, is that the key to a successful fret job is all in the prep work. The fretboard must be 100% flat, the slots need to be perfectly cut, and the frets need to be radiused and trimmed to press in with as little pressure as possible. If we take care to do all of that, it basically guarantees a quality fret job. Once those are in, I then need to dress the fret ends to be flush with the size of the fretboard before I can get on with the task of hand carving the neck. Now, there was a time earlier on in my guitar building career that I hated carving necks. It was time consuming, and I'd always end up frustrated with the final results. But somewhere along the way, I started to enjoy the process. I'm not sure what changed, but these days I settle into the job with excitement. The bulk of the material has already been removed by the operations that I performed with the CNC machine when it cut out the neck blank, and what I'm left with is carving out the profile for the back of the neck, as well as carving out the shape of the heel where the neck will meet the body. I do this work with hand tools like files, rasps, and a Japanese pool saw. I also use this amazing tool called a rolling pin sander to help out in that hard to carve area of the heel to neck transition area. It's all done by feel, and I just take my time to work the wood until I'm happy with the results. The biggest thing to consider in this step is not to take off too much wood. If I do, I'll have to start completely over on the entire neck. I know this because it's exactly what happened on my last build, and we actually made a video about that and put it up here on YouTube, so make sure you go check that out if you want to know more. And speaking of major problems, it's finally time to get into the entire reason that you probably clicked on this video in the first place. I'm going to tell you the story of how the next few months ended up testing me as a guitar builder in ways that I never saw coming. And I'm not saying that to be all YouTubery for you. This build ended up having so many issues here in the final few steps that I would end up refinishing the entire guitar 4 times. And that's not all. I ended up having to redo several steps of the body construction as well. But here I am, stupid old me. Just look at him. Thinking I'm only about 4 weeks away from stringing up the guitar for the first time. Little did I know, it would be 5 more months of pure hell before that would happen. My problems actually started way back when I was building the guitar body, but I hadn't noticed any of the individual issues until I started the step that you see me doing here. Applying finish to your project has a way of humbling you as a woodworker. As soon as the clear coats start building up on the wood, any spots that you didn't get sanded well enough will pop out and smack you in the face. It also has a way of magnifying issues in your woodworking joinery. And that's exactly what led me to realizing that I had some major issues with this build. It was after about 6 coats of lacquer that I began to come to the realization that I hadn't done a good enough job with the binding on this guitar. So I made the call to abort the finishing process, to sand everything back down to bare wood, to route off all of that original binding, abalone shell, and the arm bevel, and to redo everything. Now I'm gonna just let this video roll here as I talk because honestly I didn't get any footage of what I'm about to tell you. I was so frustrated with myself that the thought of shooting footage of the issue made me want to jump out of a window. Needless to say, making the decision to replace all of that binding didn't come lightly, and it ended up setting me back another 6 weeks before I got to where you see me right here. But it wasn't all bad news though, because look at that. While I was routing off all of the binding, I figured I might as well add some abalone trim to the sides of the guitar as well. I didn't do it the first time round, and I regretted it at the time, so I was happy for the opportunity to do it this time. The issue that I had that led me to making this decision was that there were small gaps in the glue joint of the binding in both the front and back of the guitar. Now, it wasn't anything major, and honestly, I did notice them back when I was doing the final sanding in preparation for getting the body into the paint booth. I could only really see these gaps if I had my magnifiers on, but a gap is a gap, and I knew that it wasn't good enough for prime time. So the decision to redo everything wasn't ever really an optional one for me. It just took me a few days of spraying finish before I finally came to terms with what it was that I needed to do. When you work for yourself, you're your own QC department. And when you're in the final stretches of a project, the hardest thing in the world to do is to halt the production over a small issue. But that's just it, right? Any issue with the construction isn't ever really a small issue. The people that purchase my guitars are doing so because they want the best, not almost the best. I've been known to call out fit and finish issues on guitars that cost 1/10 of what mine do on this channel. So how in the world could I ever let this slide on one of my own builds? All of this was certainly making me reflect on how I let myself get to the point where I almost let these gaps pass for good enough. Was I losing it? Did I ever even have it? It was way back here when I bent up the binding in my side bending machine. You see, up until fairly recently, I had always bent my binding by hand. It was always fairly time consuming to do it that way, so the decision to start bending it in the machine was a no-brainer. The downside to doing it this way is that the binding doesn't always come out of the machine fitting the guitar profile 100% perfectly. By bending it the second time around by hand, I slowly started to realize where I had went wrong. Faster, as it turns out, isn't always better. Sure, it took less time to bend the wood in the side bending machine, but I probably gained that time back when I glued all that binding in because I had to wrestle with it so much just to get it to fit the pocket correctly. And hell, here I am 6 weeks later still trying to recover from my time-saving method. By bending the new binding by hand, I could ensure that it fit 100% perfectly before I even glued it in. This not only saved me time during the glue-in step, but it also reminded me that every step needs to be executed at the highest level of my abilities, not to the fastest of my abilities. I know this sounds obvious, but somewhere along the way, I just lost sight of it. When I was just cutting my teeth as a guitar builder, I would obsess over every single detail of a build. As I slowly began to master these steps, it became easier to operate on autopilot. I had the right tools and jigs for every single step of the construction, and I could just go through the order of operations and end up with a pretty great product. As my business got busier, my priorities slowly became more about speed of production, and I started to rely heavily on my tools to make things faster. Well, from here out, I'll be sure to tackle every step of a build with the same level of attention that I did back when I was just starting to learn my craft. As frustrating as it was to redo all of that work, I saw this revelation as a worthy takeaway. After all, the guitar now had even better appointments on it in the form of that abalone trim on the sides, and I had a lesson that I could take with me to hopefully make all of my future guitars even better. Okay, now that I got that sorted, I'm sure it'll be smooth sailing from here. Right?
All right. A little confession for you guys. Last time you guys saw me in this video, I thought that I was pretty close to the finish line. Got the guitar in the paint booth. We're feeling really good. Well, little did I know, I was going to have a whole bunch of issues. The good news is the problems weren't really the fault of myself.
Yes, it was.
Or the fault of the guitar.
And yes, it was.
We got some new tools around here.
What I'm trying to explain here, but not doing a very good job of it, is that once I got the guitar back in the paint booth after I fixed the binding issues, I then spent the next 4 weeks respraying it and then letting it dry. When I attempted to buff it out, I somehow managed to buff right through the new lacquer on the bottom part of the guitar. When I attempted to fix that burn through spot with some light overspray, I noticed that the new lacquer was a slightly different color than the original finish for some reason. This meant that I had to refinish the entire guitar. Again. For a third time. And here I am, 2 months later, about to buff out that finish for the second attempt.
More issues. But I don't see any issues coming.
Oh, he just had to say it, didn't he? He just had to say it.
Hopefully. So yeah, join me as we get this guitar buffed out and start to get a sense of what it looks like.
This time around, everything went smoothly with the level sand and buff out. It felt so good to finally have those finish issues behind me, and I could finally start assembling the neck of the guitar. After carefully removing the masking tape from the fretboard, I could install the tuning machines, and for this build, I decided to go with a set of Waverlys with ebony buttons on them. They have a classic look, and that brass base plate that they sit on is going to age beautifully over time. I'm really happy with how they look, and it's just nice to finally see this guitar being put together instead of disassembled again. But that's when disaster struck again.
Oh my god, dude. Honestly, this guitar is making me want to quit building guitars altogether. So I was doing the buff out as we had just discussed on this guitar. Buffed it out, felt really good about the whole thing. The next morning I went to go put the neck on the guitar and found a giant crack in the back of the instrument. And I can't express to you how frustrated I am with this entire project. I was told before we built this guitar about Moon Ebony that it is very prone to cracking, so we saturated some areas with some super glue so that we could help stave off this sort of thing from happening. But we ended up having one happen in this spot right here on the very back of the instrument. I was so frustrated with the whole situation that I didn't think to actually capture any footage of the crack itself. And I actually went about going about trying to fix it in its current situation. I did all that off of camera just because I was seriously ready to smash this guitar onto the floor. So it's structurally fixed at this point, but what I realized, in order to make this actually perfect, which it obviously has to be, I'm gonna have to do some more finish work on this guitar. I got nothing else to say other than the fact that I am so over this instrument. It's going to be incredible sounding and it's incredible looking, but it's just these little itty bitty things that just keep biting me in the ass. What are you going to do but press forward and try to make it right? So I've had to push the delivery date on this guitar by another month now, so that is a big shock to the system here for the business in the shop. But what we must do is continue on, move forward, and get this thing sorted out so that it looks like nothing ever happened. I'm not worried about it structurally, but we do have to get it fixed up visually perfect. So here we go again. Okay, here's where we've landed. What I've done is I've gone ahead and given the entire guitar body a decent scuff down to 320, and then I brought it all the way back up to 400 grit. Now, the soundboard. I have had the ever so slightest little bit of issue here in my purfling and pearl area where there's this weird discoloration that's going on, and it seems like the finish isn't wanting to stick to it. So I've made the decision that I'm going to sand off all of the finish off the soundboard and do a full respray on the soundboard. It's just the best thing to do. That way we can make sure that this guitar is absolutely perfect, and it's going to give me peace of mind so that I can sleep at night. I'm going to hit this up starting with probably 180 grit and just work my way down, trying to not remove any material from the soundboard itself, and then we'll get back in the booth.
The process of removing the finish was a bit stressful because I didn't want to remove any more material off of the soundboard, as I had already done this twice up to this point. I just took my time and did most of the work by hand so that I could be sure that I wouldn't have any more mistakes to deal with in the future. I just needed to mask everything off on the front of the guitar one last time and then get it back into the paint booth. Fast forward 3 weeks and it's finally done. Like, for real. It all came out perfect this time. The next 2 weeks of the build were spent doing things like gluing on the bridge and making the nut. These times were blissful and comparatively stress-free. Now that I was out of the woods and the guitar was done, I got to sit back and just admire my hard work. This build took me to the brink of my sanity and made me question the choices that I had made in my career, and even made me question my identity as a craftsperson. But now that it was all done, those feelings weren't there anymore. The only thing that I felt was gratitude. Gratitude to this guitar for showing me that success is rarely linear, and gratitude to this profession of lutherie for continually challenging me and making me a better person. This job isn't glamorous, but it's rarely boring. Oh yeah, and by the way, this guitar might be the best sounding one I've ever made. Are you ready to hear it?